Growing up, cheating and heartbreak weren't just distant stories I overheard. They were the constant noise in my everyday life. My dad's affairs weren't some dark family secret. They were open, festering wounds that everyone in our house had to live with. His late nights, the unexplained disappearances, and the unmistakable scent of cheap perfume clinging to his shirts were daily reminders of his disloyalty. My mom, on the other hand, stayed loyal, almost painfully so. As a kid, I couldn't wrap my head around why she stuck around, why she put up with the humiliation. Back then, I believed in love, the kind that could survive anything. But watching the cracks in their marriage splinter into something unfixable shattered that belief. I learned early that trust is fragile, and love can easily be turned into a weapon. I promised myself that my life wouldn't end up like that. When I met Emily in high school, I thought I'd finally found what I was searching for: kindness, loyalty, and a shared future. Our relationship felt strong, grounded in mutual respect and honesty. We mostly dated each other all through high school, though we briefly dated other people during fights, always finding our way back to one another. We gave each other our innocence before prom and got married 9 months after graduation. As far as I knew, I was the only man she had ever been with. From the moment we said, "I do," I envisioned a future far removed from the chaos I grew up in. I was determined to give Emily the kind of stability my mom never had. But even the strongest foundation can crack. I would soon learn that the security I thought we had built was nothing more than an illusion, one that couldn't stand up to the unexpected storms life had in store. The night Emily decided to be with another man wasn't just any night. It marked the beginning of the end. Maybe she thought I'd be okay with it, that chasing some fleeting excitement wouldn't matter to me. Maybe she was right about the thrill, but she miscalculated how deep the cut would go. What she saw as a harmless fling, I saw as the moment our marriage started to crumble. I remember the day it all began like it happened yesterday. I was sitting at my desk, sipping coffee and thinking about how normal that morning had felt. Then my phone rang. The number on the screen wasn't one I recognized. I almost let it go, thinking it was another scam call, but something told me to answer. "Hey, babe," I said, assuming it was Emily calling from a different number. "This isn't your wife, Mr. Parker?" A man's voice replied, cold and serious. I blinked, confused. Yeah, this is Daniel Parker, but most people call me Dan." "Who is this?" "My name is Mark Evans. I work with Emily. I need to speak with you in person. Can you meet me this afternoon?" His voice didn't offer any explanation, but his tone was serious enough to make my stomach knot. "Is Emily okay? She seemed fine this morning." "She's fine," he said flatly. "But I have some information about her that you need to know. Can you meet me at noon?" He refused to say more over the phone. Reluctantly, and feeling a growing sense of dread, I agreed. At noon sharp, I met Mark outside a small diner. He suggested we walk to avoid being overheard, so we headed toward the park. "Your wife has been spending a lot of time with a man named Brian Collins at work," he started. "They have lunch together every day. Today, they were talking openly about their plans for tomorrow night. Dinner at the Hilton, dancing, and staying overnight." My stomach dropped. "Are you saying they're sleeping together?" "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Brian already booked the hotel, and your wife is out shopping for something new to wear for the night." I felt like I was going to be sick. How do they think this is going to work? "Emily believes you love her enough to let her explore being with another man. She thinks it won't affect your marriage." I stopped in my tracks, struggling to process what he was telling me. "Why are you even telling me this?" Mark's expression hardened. "I was married for 9 years. My wife had an affair, and the legal system tore me apart. Now I try to help other guys avoid what happened to me." We talked for a little while longer before he left, but his words kept spinning in my head. If he was telling the truth, then everything I believed about Emily was a lie. That terrified me. I thought back to my childhood, watching my mom suffer because of my dad's cheating. My dad was a heavy drinker and a shameless womanizer. He didn't just cheat on my mom. He mocked her for staying. Once, when I was around 11, he took me to his girlfriend's house. I got bored and walked home. When I told my mom where I had been, she didn't confront him. But 2 days later, he whipped me with a belt for breaking a plate. Looking back, I realized he wasn't punishing me for the plate. He was punishing me for exposing him. After witnessing how much pain my mom endured, I swore I'd never tolerate cheating in my own marriage. Even the thought of it made me sick. Call me what you want, but I wasn't going to live through what my mom did. Eventually, she left my dad and remarried. Life got better for both of us after that. Emily and I lived in a house owned by my mom and stepdad. That fact weighed on me as I thought about what to do. Confront her, ignore it, or wait it out. As a salesman, I was trained to be proactive, not sit back and wait for things to happen. But in this case, if Mark was right, then I didn't know Emily at all. She knew exactly how I felt about infidelity, and yet here we were. I needed to take action, but carefully. I decided to hire a private investigator. After a short meeting and spending more money than I was comfortable with, we had a plan in place. Now I just had to figure out how to act when I got home. When I walked in that evening, Emily was there, all smiles. She kissed me and hugged me like nothing was wrong. I had to decide, should I act like everything was normal or give her a hint that I knew something was up? If I acted normal, she'd continue with her plans. If I hinted at what I knew, she might deny it and hope it blew over. And if I acted suspicious, she might cancel everything. I decided to play it cool. We had dinner, pork chops, just like always. Acting like nothing was wrong was harder than I thought. Either Emily was a world-class actress, or she was so sure of herself that she didn't even bother hiding it. At 11 p.m., I went upstairs. Emily was already asleep. I showered and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. At 6 a.m., she got up, got dressed, and left the house without saying goodbye. That wasn't like her. It was Friday, usually a busy day for RV sales, but I called my boss and took the day off. Then I called our dealership's attorney to ask for a divorce lawyer. He referred me to his wife but warned me she didn't take cases for men who cheated. I met with her, explained everything Mark had told me, and why I'd hired a private investigator. She advised me to wait for proof. If Emily was as confident as Mark claimed, she wouldn't cancel her plans. I told her I wouldn't tolerate cheating of any kind, and if Emily went through with it, I wanted divorce papers ready by Monday. If Mark was wrong, I'd deal with it. But if he was right, I'd be prepared. And so, the paperwork was set in motion. The night seemed endless as I sat alone in the dim glow of the living room. My mind spiraling into places I didn't want to explore. Caroline's lie, though small and seemingly inconsequential, had planted a seed of unease deep inside me. And when you've spent nearly half your life with someone, even the tiniest fracture in the foundation of trust can feel like the beginnings of a devastating earthquake. I wrestled with my thoughts, trying to drown out the nagging voice in my head that whispered unsettling, unthinkable scenarios. Maybe she's just out with friends, I told myself, clinging to rationality. But if that were the case, why lie about it? Why not just say, I'm out grabbing dinner with someone, or I needed to step out for a while? Caroline had never been the type to avoid honesty or confrontation, and I couldn't think of a single instance in our 24 years together where she'd hidden something so trivial. The idea that she might be hiding something, or worse, someone, clawed at the edges of my mind. But even as suspicion crept in, a part of me recoiled at the thought. No, not Caroline. Not the woman who had stood beside me through life's storms, who had poured her energy into raising our 2 kids, who had been my partner, my equal, in every way that mattered. Caroline was my rock. At least she had been. I kept telling myself that her lie didn't mean anything, that I was just overanalyzing an innocent oversight. But the harder I tried to convince myself, the louder those creeping doubts became, refusing to be silenced. Out of nowhere, a memory surfaced. Uninvited, like an old wound that never quite healed. It was from about 4 years ago, just after we had celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. Caroline and her sister Rachel had come home from a shopping trip while I was lying on the couch nursing a bad headache. Half asleep, I'd stayed quiet as their voices drifted into the living room. Rachel's voice, naturally louder and brasher than Caroline's, carried through the house effortlessly. Did you notice that new guy working at the grocery store? The one with those dimples? She asked, her tone unmistakably flirtatious. Caroline's laugh was soft but dismissive. Yeah, I saw him, she said lightly. He's cute, I guess. But Rachel, seriously, you need to be careful. What if Mike finds out? Rachel's response had been quick and full of defiance. Oh, please. I'm always careful. And besides, he'd never find out. Men like Mike never notice these things. I remembered the tight knot in my stomach as I lay there, pretending to be asleep. Caroline hadn't agreed with her sister's actions. Her tone was disapproving, but she hadn't outright condemned them either. Something about her reaction had unsettled me. It wasn't enough to spark a conversation back then, but it had lingered in the back of my mind like an unanswered question I didn't dare ask. Rachel had always been reckless, a free spirit who thrived on chaos. She cheated on her husband, Mike, repeatedly, with a string of flings and short-lived affairs. When her marriage inevitably fell apart, I wasn't surprised. Mike had been crushed, blindsided by her betrayal, and had packed up and left without looking back. As painful as it must have been for him, I had admired Mike's resolve, his refusal to tolerate being disrespected. Back then, I'd wondered if I'd have the strength to walk away from Caroline if I ever found myself in his position. Now, sitting alone in the silent, darkened living room, I couldn't help but replay that long-ago conversation between Caroline and Rachel. Had Rachel's attitude rubbed off on Caroline in ways I hadn't noticed? Was I overthinking this whole situation? Or was there something lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly stable life? Something I hadn't been willing to see? By the time the clock neared midnight, I couldn't sit there any longer. I had to do something. Anything. Sitting in that room, stewing in my own thoughts, wasn't going to give me the answers I needed. I decided to call Caroline's direct line at Brightwave Advertising. Maybe she wasn't at home because she was stuck at the office working late. It wouldn't explain why she hadn't told me the truth, but it might at least give me some clarity. The phone rang twice before a man answered. Brightwave Advertising. This is Jason Miller. Jason was one of Caroline's co-workers, a junior copywriter who joined the company a couple of years back. I'd never met him in person, but I'd heard his name in passing. Hey, Jason, I said, trying to sound casual. It's Alex, Caroline's husband. Is she around? There was a pause, followed by a hint of surprise in his voice. Oh, hey, Alex. No, Caroline's not here. I thought you guys were on vacation. His words hit me like a sledgehammer. Vacation, I repeated, my voice faltering. Yeah, Jason continued, oblivious to the growing panic in my tone. She said she was taking a few days off to relax. Something about a break. Didn't she tell you? I scrambled to regain my composure. Oh, right. Yeah, she did. I guess I just forgot. It's been a hectic week. Jason didn't seem to notice my discomfort. Gotcha. Well, anyway, I hope you two are enjoying yourselves. I've got a deadline to meet, so I better get back to it. Take care, Alex. I muttered a quick goodbye and hung up, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. Vacation? What vacation? And then there was the mention of a break. Caroline hadn't said anything about taking time off, and as far as I knew, there wasn't even a remote possibility that she was at some retreat or resort. None of it made sense. And then there was the most jarring part. Jason's offhand comment about the lake house. We didn't own a lake house. Neither did anyone in Caroline's family. The mention of it set off every alarm in my head. Who was she with? Where was she? Determined to find answers, I opened my laptop and pulled up the Find My Phone app we had installed on both of our devices about a year ago. Caroline had a habit of misplacing her phone, leaving it in the car, at the grocery store, or buried under piles of laundry, so we'd set up the tracker as a precaution. It took just a few seconds for the app to load, pinpointing her location on the map. My stomach dropped when I saw where the blinking dot was. It wasn't at our house. It wasn't at her office. It wasn't even at a restaurant or a friend's place. Mills Lake wasn't just another neighborhood. It was one of the wealthiest areas in the city, known for its sprawling mansions, gated communities, and homes that cost more than I could make in 10 lifetimes. It was a world we didn't belong to, a world entirely out of our league. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What could she possibly be doing there? And more importantly, who was she with? As much as I tried to stay rational, the sinking feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the thought that something was seriously wrong. There was only one way to find out. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to Mills Lake was just under an hour, but it felt like an eternity. My thoughts churned the entire way, a toxic mix of anger, fear, and dread. A part of me still hoped there was some kind of innocent explanation waiting for me at the end of this drive. But the other part of me, the darker, more skeptical part, was bracing for the worst. When I arrived, I parked a little ways down the street, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I walked the rest of the way, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the estate where Caroline's phone was supposedly located. The property was massive, far more luxurious than I had imagined. Tall stone walls surrounded it, and the imposing gates at the front were locked tight. I circled the perimeter, looking for another way in. Finally, I reached the edge of the property, where it backed up to the lake. A narrow path led down to the water, and after following it, I found a section of the wall that was slightly lower. Summoning every ounce of nerve I had, I climbed over and landed softly on the other side. Moving carefully, I stuck to the shadows as I approached the house. The windows were massive, spilling warm light out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. I edged closer, careful to stay silent. When I finally peered through one of the windows, my blood turned to ice. You'd think going through divorce proceedings would bring some kind of closure, maybe relief, but all I felt was bone-deep exhaustion. Emily's cheating drained me in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the affair. It was how easily she dismissed everything we built together, like our marriage was some toy she could play with and toss aside after one night of fun. That cold indifference cut deeper than the affair itself. After the meeting with the lawyers, I went back to the dealership. I was there physically, but mentally, checked out. My co-workers kept their distance. Guess they could sense something was off. I didn't need anyone's pity or their nosy questions. I just needed to stay busy, keep moving, and avoid thinking about how much my life had fallen apart. Later that week, Michael Evans gave me a call. "Hey Dan, just a heads up, Brian Collins quit today. No notice, just packed up and left." I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling. "Any clue where he went?" Michael chuckled, his tone carrying a hint of sarcasm. "Rumor is he's heading to Florida, maybe chasing a fresh start." "Perfect," I muttered. "Let him rot in the sun." Michael let out a dry laugh. "Figured you'd want to know. Take care, Dan." After hanging up, I just stared at my phone. Florida. That explained why Emily had gone radio silent. I hadn't heard from her in days, and now it made sense. She wasn't hiding out, feeling guilty. She was probably running off to start a new life with Brian. I couldn't decide what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to wash my hands of it all. But another part, the part that still needed closure, couldn't let it go. I needed Emily to sign those divorce papers. Until then, it wasn't over. So I called Megan. "Hello." Her voice was cautious. "Hey, do you or anyone in your family know people in Florida?" A long pause. "Why?" "Because I think Emily's there, and she still needs to sign the divorce papers." Another pause, heavier this time. "She's in Fort Lauderdale." I tightened my grip on the phone. "How long have you known?" "A few days," she admitted quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you." "You should have," I snapped. "I'm done playing games." I hung up and immediately called my lawyer, giving him the address. Megan finally coughed up. He promised to get the papers to Emily right away. I thought I'd feel some kind of relief. I didn't, just more anger. Emily had lied about everything, and now she was hiding miles away, thinking she could dodge the inevitable. But I wasn't finished yet. A few days later, I was sitting at my desk when Michael called again. "Got some news for you," he said. "Let's hear it." "Brian Collins called the office today. Asked for his job back." I laughed. A real bitter laugh. "Seriously?" "Dead serious. They told him no, obviously." "Of course. Guy burned every bridge he had. Thought you'd get a kick out of that. Thanks, Michael. I hung up, shaking my head. Brian was pathetic. First, he tries to steal my wife, and now he's crawling back, begging for a job he ditched. Almost funny, if it wasn't so sad. But then something clicked. If Brian was desperate enough to beg for his job back, maybe things weren't going so great down in Florida. Maybe Emily wasn't getting that perfect new life she thought she would. That thought, I won't lie, it gave me a little satisfaction. Weeks crawled by. Emily still hadn't signed the divorce papers. My lawyer kept trying to reach her, but she wasn't responding. I started to wonder if I'd ever be free of her. Then Megan called. Dan, I need to tell you something. I didn't answer. Emily kicked Brian out. Silence. But he came back, and he beat her. Bad. She's in the hospital. My stomach twisted. Not because I cared about Emily anymore, but because of how fast things had spiraled. What about the baby? I asked. Regretted it the second the words left my mouth. There was no baby. She lied. And with that, the last thread snapped. Then I have nothing left to say to her, I said flatly and hung up. Not long after, my lawyer confirmed Emily finally signed the divorce papers. Just like that, it was done. The house felt hollow, but at least it was mine now. I went room by room, clearing out anything that reminded me of her. I swapped out the photos on the walls, dumped her leftover stuff. Piece by piece, I was reclaiming my space, my life. Work became my escape. I sold more RVs in those few weeks than I had in months. I poured every ounce of energy into the dealership, anything to avoid the silence waiting for me at home. Then my boss called me into his office. Dan, you need a break. I'm fine, I lied. No, you're not. He leaned forward. Remember the Jacobsons? That couple you sold the Blue Pros motorhome to? Yeah. Well, Mr. Jacobson had a heart attack up in Vancouver. He's stable now, but they need someone to drive their RV back. They specifically asked for you. I blinked. Why me? Said you're the only one they trust. I told them you could use the time off. Might do you some good. I thought it over. Yeah, maybe you're right. The trip to Vancouver was uneventful. I met the Jacobsons at the hospital. Mrs. Jacobson was warm as ever, hovering over her husband while he grumbled about the fuss. Their granddaughter Darla was there too, helping pack their things. She barely looked at me. Figures. She's been driving the RV while we've been here, Mrs. Jacobson explained. She'll help you get it ready for the trip back. Darla didn't seem thrilled. I didn't care. I just wanted to get the job done. The first leg of the drive was tense. Darla wasn't interested in small talk, and I wasn't in the mood to force it. Eventually, we settled into silence. But somewhere between Idaho and Texas, something shifted. Maybe it was the endless hours on the road. Maybe it was the quiet that neither of us tried to fill. Slowly, the tension eased. Turned out, she wasn't as bad as I thought. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as bitter as I believed. By the time we rolled back into Houston, something between us felt different. Not perfect, but different. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The long drive back to Houston with Darla gave me far too much time to think. Mile after mile of highway stretched ahead. Nothing but the steady hum of the RV engine and my own thoughts keeping me company. And those thoughts, they weren't exactly kind. Emily was gone. The divorce papers had been signed, and legally, she wasn't my wife anymore. But a piece of paper doesn't erase scars. It didn't wipe away the image of her casually telling me she was going out with another man, kissing me goodbye like it was the most normal thing in the world. That smug confidence that I would just accept it haunted me more than the cheating itself. I wondered if she regretted it now, lying in a hospital bed after Brian turned violent. A small part of me thought she deserved to feel the weight of her choices. Not the bruises or pain, but the cold realization that her one night of fun had destroyed everything. Still, another part of me, the one carrying years of baggage from watching my mom cling to my cheating father, just felt tired. Emily had turned into a ghost in my life. She tried to reach me through Megan, but I shut that door. Any apology she had cooked up was too little, too late. I wasn't about to become my mother, hanging on to someone who treated her like garbage. I wasn't going to forgive cheating, but moving on, that was proving harder than I expected. And Darla wasn't exactly helping. The first couple of days on the road, Darla barely spoke a word to me. Every time I asked her a question or needed her help, she acted like I was a burden, rolling her eyes, sighing dramatically. After everything I'd been through, I didn't have the patience for it. But something shifted by the third day. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe all that silence finally got to her. Slowly, we started talking. First, it was small stuff, where to stop for food, how far we should drive before resting. Then, the conversations started getting deeper. She asked about my job, how I ended up selling RVs, and eventually about my marriage. I didn't tell her everything. Just enough. She didn't pry, and I appreciated that. In return, she cracked the door open a little on her own life. Darla wasn't close with her parents. Her relationship with her grandparents was complicated, but you could tell she respected them. She hinted at a few bad relationships in her past but didn't go into details. I didn't ask. By the time we finally rolled back into Houston, the ice between us had thawed into something else. Not friendship exactly. More like a silent agreement, a truce, a mutual understanding. Walking back into the dealership, I noticed how quiet everything felt. My coworkers barely looked at me. Maybe they knew about the divorce, maybe not. Either way, I didn't care. Let them talk. Later that day, the Jacobsons called to thank me for bringing their RV back safely. Mrs. Jacobson, sweet as ever, invited me to a barbecue they were throwing to celebrate her husband's recovery. "Bring your wife," she added cheerfully. My stomach tightened. I hadn't told them about the divorce. "Actually, I'm not married anymore," I said, keeping my voice flat. There was a brief pause. "Oh, Dan, I'm so sorry to hear that. But come anyway. We'd still love to have you." I told her I'd think about it. The next few days blurred together: work, sleep, repeat. My house felt emptier without Emily's things, but I wouldn't let that bother me. I kept my head down, focusing on selling RVs and steering clear of personal conversations. Then Darla walked into the dealership. I spotted her near the entrance, standing awkwardly, holding something in her hand. "You left this in the RV," she said, holding out my phone. "Oh," I muttered, taking it. "Thanks." She didn't leave. "You know," she said slowly, "you're not as much of a jerk as I thought." I smirked. "And you're not as unbearable as I figured." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. "My grandparents are still having that barbecue," she added. "You should come. I'll be there." I stared at her for a second, trying to read her tone. Was this some kind of olive branch? "Maybe," I said. She shrugged. "Suit yourself." Then she left. Friday night came, and somehow, I found myself pulling up to the Jacobsons' house. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was tired of being alone. Maybe I was curious about Darla. Or maybe Mrs. Jacobson's warmth had gotten through to me. Their backyard was alive with laughter, the smell of food grilling, and the hum of conversation. Mrs. Jacobson greeted me with a tight hug. "Dan, I'm so glad you came," she beamed. "Come. Let me introduce you to everyone." I let her lead me into the crowd, offering polite smiles and nods as I met their friends and family. Eventually, I spotted Darla talking with a small group. She caught my eye and gave me a small, almost shy smile. Later, as the night wound down, Darla made her way over to me. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," she said, holding a drink. "Yeah, well, I didn't have anything better to do." "Charming as always," she teased. For the first time in a while I chuckled, and it wasn't forced. The night ended with Darla and me sitting on the Jacobsons' porch, away from the crowd and noise. "So what now?" she asked. "What do you mean? Now that you're officially divorced, what's next?" I thought about it, and for once I didn't have an answer. "Start over, I guess." She nodded. "Makes sense." Silence settled between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "You know," she said quietly, "you could have kicked Emily out the first time she screwed up. Why didn't you?" I stared out at the dark yard. Because I wanted to believe she was better than that. I thought our marriage actually meant something to her. And I didn't want to be like my dad. Darla didn't say anything for a moment. "Well, you're not," she said softly. I turned to look at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. "Thanks," I said quietly. We sat there for a while longer, the cool night air wrapping around us. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Emily. I wasn't stuck in the past. I was finally thinking about what could come next. The barbecue at the Jacobsons' place was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was drowning in my own misery. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the smell of grilled food, it all felt normal. Something I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. And somehow, right in the middle of all that noise and comfort, Darla found a way to slip past the walls I didn't even realize I had built around myself. We didn't talk about Emily. We didn't bring up Brian or the divorce. None of that. For one night, that whole nightmare didn't exist. And damn, it felt good. But life has a way of reminding you that peace doesn't last. The next few days, I buried myself in work. Selling RVs became my escape. The sales floor was simple: pitch, negotiate, close. No surprises. No lies. Just business. It was predictable, and I needed that. Then my mother called. I stared at the phone for a while before I finally answered. We hadn't talked much since the divorce started. She tried to convince me to forgive Emily, to work it out. Like that was even possible. How do you forgive someone who spits in your face and calls it love? "Hey, Mom," I answered, guarded. She hesitated. "Dan, we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "About what?" "Emily, of course." "What about her?" I asked, my tone colder than I meant it to be. "She's been trying to reach you. She's not doing well." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Mom, I don't care. She made her choices. She can deal with them." "It's not that simple," she said softly. "She's in the hospital again." I felt my stomach tighten. "Let me guess. Brian." A long pause. "No. She tried to hurt herself." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a second, I didn't know what to say. "Mom, I'm not telling you to forgive her," she cut in quickly. "But maybe you should talk to her. Just for closure. For both of you." I stayed quiet. "Just think about it, okay?" she said before hanging up. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at my phone. I knew Emily's number by heart, but I didn't call. I didn't want to hear excuses or apologies. I wanted to move on. But now, there was this nagging thought in the back of my mind. Maybe I needed to hear her out. Not to forgive her, but to finally close that chapter. Not yet. Instead, I called Megan. "Hello. It's Dan." Silence. Then, "Why are you calling me?" "Mom told me about Emily." Another pause. "Yeah. She's not doing great." "How bad is it?" I asked, not sure if I really wanted to know. "Bad enough. Brian's gone. Her friends cut her off. She's alone." I let out a slow breath. "That's not my problem anymore." "I know," Megan replied quietly. "But she wasn't always like this. She was my sister before she was your wife." I didn't have a response to that. "I'm not calling her," I said finally. "I didn't ask you to," Megan said, then ended the call. Days passed. I drowned myself in work, but something was different now. That conversation with my mom and Megan stuck with me like a splinter. I kept telling myself I didn't care, that Emily's problems were her own. But it wasn't that easy. One evening after closing the dealership, I found myself driving without a destination. My truck somehow ended up parked outside the Jacobsons' house. Their windows glowed with warm light, laughter spilling out onto the porch. I sat there for a few minutes, debating whether to go in. Then Darla stepped outside. She spotted me immediately and smirked. "You planning to just sit there all night?" she called out. I sighed and climbed out of the truck. Wasn't sure if I should come in. "Why not?" she asked, leaning against the porch railing. "Didn't want to kill the mood." She rolled her eyes. "Please, you think you're that important?" I let out a quiet laugh despite myself. "Come in," she said, turning toward the door. "Unless you'd rather sulk out here." Inside, the Jacobsons' home felt like a warm hug. Mr. Jacobson was settled comfortably in his chair, still recovering but smiling. Mrs. Jacobson greeted me with a tight hug and immediately dragged me into the kitchen, where the counters were covered in food. Darla hovered nearby, eyeing me. "You look like you need a drink," she said. "Yeah, probably." She handed me a glass of wine. I took a sip, leaning on the counter. "So," she started, "what's got you looking like hell?" I hesitated. "Emily," I admitted. Darla raised an eyebrow. "Thought you were done with that." "I am. But she's in the hospital." Darla didn't answer right away. She just sipped her wine. "You gonna see her?" she asked eventually. "I don't know." "You don't owe her anything," she said flatly. "I know. But did I?" I barely slept that night. My mind kept drifting to Emily in that hospital bed. It wasn't guilt. I wasn't sure I had any of that left for her. It was more like unfinished business. The next day, I made a choice. I drove to the hospital. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit me as I walked through the doors. I've never liked hospitals. Too many bad memories. I stopped at the front desk. "I'm here to see Emily Parker." The nurse checked the records. "Room 314. My heart thumped as I took the elevator up. I didn't know what I was going to say. Hell, I didn't even know why I was there. When I pushed open the door, I barely recognized her. Emily looked frail, pale. Her hair was a mess, and dark circles hung under her eyes. She glanced up slowly, confusion flashing across her face. "Dan?" I stood in the doorway, hands stuffed in my pockets. "I'm not here to fix anything," I said, my tone flat. "I just came to say goodbye. For real this time." Her lip trembled, and for a fleeting second, I saw the woman I once married. But that woman was gone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to." As I walked out of the hospital, a weight I hadn't noticed before lifted off my shoulders. It was over. Really over. That night, without thinking, I drove to Darla's house. I didn't call ahead. When she opened the door, surprised to see me, I didn't say a word. I just kissed her. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. And for once, I was ready to start living again. Kissing Darla wasn't something I thought through. It wasn't planned, and it sure wasn't some half-baked attempt to fill the hole Emily left behind. It just happened. One minute I was standing on her porch, cold air biting at my skin, and the next I was leaning in, closing the space between us. For a second, I wondered if she'd push me away. Maybe she'd tell me off for acting impulsively, for crossing some invisible line neither of us had acknowledged. But she didn't. She kissed me back, and it wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was steady and real, like she'd been waiting for me to make a move. When we finally pulled apart, both of us a little breathless, Darla just stared at me, like she was trying to figure out what the hell just happened. I started, but the words didn't come. "Don't," she said softly, cutting me off. "Just don't explain." So I didn't. She stepped aside without saying another word, silently inviting me in. The door clicked shut behind me, and we both stood there in quiet stillness. It didn't take long before we crossed another line. The next morning, I woke up tangled in sheets that weren't mine. For a few seconds, I didn't recognize the room. But then the faint smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, and it all came back. Darla, the kiss, the night, all of it. I sat up and ran a hand through my hair. Part of me wondered if I should feel guilty. Not because of Emily, she was ancient history, but because Darla was the Jacobsons' granddaughter. This wasn't some random hookup. Could get complicated. But when Darla walked in holding 2 mugs of coffee, she didn't look like she was overthinking it. "Morning," she said, handing me a mug. "Morning." She sat down on the edge of the bed, sipping her coffee. For a while, neither of us said a word. It wasn't uncomfortable. "So," she started, breaking the silence, "do we need to talk about this?" I let out a breath. "Do you want to?" She thought about it. "No. Then we won't." And that was that. The days after were different. Not awkward, not strained. Just different. Darla and I didn't bring up that night, but it lingered between us. We texted more often, found reasons to bump into each other. It wasn't a relationship, but it wasn't nothing either. For the first time in a long while, it felt like I was moving forward. Like I wasn't drowning in the wreckage Emily left behind. But the past has a funny way of creeping back. Michael Evans called me again. "Got another update for you," he said. I leaned back in my chair. "Let me guess. Brian's back." "Not exactly, but he's been poking around. Word is he's trying to get in touch with Emily." I frowned. "Why?" "She kicked him out. Desperation, maybe. Or maybe he wants another shot." I scoffed. "She's not that dumb." Michael was quiet for a beat. "You sure about that?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure. Emily had already proven she wasn't great at making smart decisions. "Anyway," Michael said, "thought you'd want to know." "Yeah, thanks." I hung up, my mood darkened. Brian sniffing around Emily's life again unsettled me, even though it wasn't my problem anymore. Still, it was a reminder of how messy things had gotten, how close I'd come to losing myself. I wasn't going back there. That weekend, Mrs. Jacobson invited me over for dinner. I had a feeling Darla had nudged her into it, but she played innocent when I asked. The Jacobsons' house felt as warm as ever. Laughter, good food, the smell of something baking in the oven. It was the kind of comfort I hadn't realized I missed. Mrs. Jacobson greeted me with a hug, and Mr. Jacobson gave me a firm handshake, though he still seemed a bit fragile. Dinner was relaxed. No heavy talks, no awkward silences. Just good food and easy conversation. After dessert, Mrs. Jacobson leaned in a little closer. "Trey," she said softly, her tone gentle, "I know you've been through a lot." I tensed a little but didn't interrupt. "I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, but I've been watching you these past few weeks. You're not the same man who sold us that RV." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. "People change," I replied carefully. "They do. But don't let pain change you into someone you're not. It's okay to let good things in." I didn't know how to respond. Before I could say anything, Darla strolled in and saved me from having to. "Grandma, stop scaring him," she teased. Mrs. Jacobson just smiled knowingly, but her words stuck with me. Later that night, Darla and I sat on the hood of my truck in her driveway, staring up at the sky. Neither of us seemed in a rush to end the night. "You're thinking too much," she said without looking at me. "Maybe. About Emily?" I hesitated. "A little. She's not your problem anymore." "I know." "Then stop letting her live rent-free in your head." Easier said than done. She glanced at me. "You don't have to figure everything out right now, Trey." "I'm trying." "I know." She nudged my shoulder. "Come inside." I followed her without a second thought. A few days later, Megan called. "Trey," she said, her voice serious. "You need to know something." "What now?" "Brian found Emily." I closed my eyes. "What do you mean he found her?" "He showed up at the hospital. Tried to get in. Security stopped him." "Jesus." "It gets worse. He's been calling her nonstop, threatening her." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't know what else to do. She's not my responsibility." "I know, but I'm scared. He's dangerous." I paused. I didn't want to care. I didn't want to be dragged back into Emily's mess. But if Brian was dangerous, if something happened to her, would I regret not doing something? "Keep your phone close," I said. That night, sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept circling back to Brian, to Emily, to how fast things could unravel. The next morning, I called Michael. "I need a favor." "Name it." "Keep an eye on Brian. If he goes near Emily again, I want to know." Michael chuckled. "Didn't think you still cared." "I don't," I lied. "I just don't trust him." "Consider it done." I hung up, unsettled. Later that day, I ended up at Darla's place again. She opened the door, studying me. "You look like hell. Didn't sleep." "Emily?" "Brian." Darla didn't say a word. She just stepped aside, letting me in. For the first time, I realized how much I needed her quiet strength, her steady presence. I didn't know what was happening between us, but it was the only thing keeping me grounded. And right now, that was enough. Weeks slipped by, and the chaos that once ruled my life finally began to settle. The dealership was busier than ever. Customers coming and going, deals being made, and the usual workplace gossip filling the air. It was a strange kind of comfort. My days were predictable, and after everything I'd been through, that felt like a gift. Darla and I had grown closer, though neither of us put a label on whatever was happening between us. And honestly, I didn't need one. What we had was steady, uncomplicated, something I hadn't known in a long time. After the emotional mess that was my marriage, I was grateful for the quiet, the ease. But even with the calm, there was still a shadow creeping at the edge of my life. Stan Morrison. Michael Evans continued updating me about him. From what he gathered, Stan had been lurking around Emily's apartment building. He hadn't made direct contact, but the fact that he was hanging around was enough to set me on edge. It was like he was waiting for the right moment to make a move, hiding just out of sight. And it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't because I still loved Emily. I didn't. It wasn't about caring for her feelings either. But deep down, I still felt responsible. And I hated that. I wanted to shake off that guilt, but it clung to me like a second skin I couldn't shed. One Friday night, after a long shift at the dealership, I found myself driving to Darla's house. I didn't plan it. I hadn't even called. My hands just steered me there. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. "You always show up when you're overthinking something," she said, stepping aside. "Is that so?" She gave me a knowing smile. "Yeah, and you've been thinking a lot lately." I didn't argue. I dropped onto her couch, sinking into the cushions. Darla disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 2 beers. "So, what is it this time?" she asked, handing me one. "Stan." Her face darkened. "He's still hanging around?" "Yeah. Michael says he's been near Emily's place." "And why does that bother you?" "It shouldn't." I sighed. "But it does." Darla didn't say anything for a moment. She just took a slow sip of her beer. "You're not responsible for her," she finally said. "I know. But I still feel like I am." Darla leaned back, watching me carefully. "You're not her shield, Trey. Not anymore. She made her choices." "I'm not looking to save her," I said, my voice steady. "But if something happens and I could have stopped it, I couldn't live with that." Darla exhaled, staring at me for a moment. "So, what are you going to do?" I ran my thumb over the condensation on my beer bottle, thinking, I don't know yet. Turns out I didn't have to wait long to figure it out. The next morning, Michael called. "Stan was at Emily's apartment last night," he said, skipping any kind of greeting. My grip on the phone tightened. "Did he get inside?" "No." Security stopped him, but it was close. He was drunk, screaming at the building. Jesus. She filed a restraining order. But let's be real. That's not going to stop him. I was already thinking ahead. "Thanks for the update. Keep me posted." After hanging up, I sat there in silence. This wasn't going to stop on its own. I had to confront him. Michael had already passed me the address of the rundown motel where Stan was staying. It was the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the paint was peeling off the doors. Exactly the sort of place where a guy like Stan would end up. I pulled into the parking lot, immediately spotting his rusty sedan. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned or cared for in months. I waited for a while, just watching the door to his room. Eventually, it creaked open, and Stan stumbled out, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. I got out of my truck and walked toward him. He noticed me right away. His eyes narrowed. "What the hell do you want?" "I should be asking you the same thing," I said, keeping my voice calm. Stan scoffed. "Oh, what now? Gonna act like the protective ex-husband? Hate to break it to you, but you're not her problem anymore." "No, I'm not. But you need to stay away from her." He let out a bitter laugh. "Or what? You gonna beat me up?" I took a step closer. "No. But I swear to God, If you go near her again, I'll make your life a living hell. For a second, his smirk faltered, but he covered it up quickly. You think I'm scared of you? I think you should be. We stood there, the tension stretching thin. Stan took a long drag of his cigarette. You know, she wanted this. I didn't force her into anything. That doesn't matter. It's over. Move on. He flicked the cigarette away, watching it bounce on the pavement. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I didn't move. Last warning, Stan. He didn't say anything else as I turned and walked back to my truck. But it didn't feel like the end of it. If anything, it made me realize how unstable he really was. I made one last stop. Emily's apartment was in a rough part of town. The kind of place where you double-lock your doors and keep your head down. I knocked on her door, not even sure if she'd answer. When she did, she looked worse than I remembered. Pale, thin, dark circles under her eyes. Trey? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm not here about us, I said quickly. Stan's dangerous. You need to take this seriously. She swallowed hard. I filed the restraining order. That won't stop him. What do you expect me to do? Leave. Go stay with your parents. Go anywhere but here. She hesitated. Why do you even care? I didn't answer. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. I'll think about it. I didn't wait for more. I turned and left. That night, sitting at home, I finally felt some relief. I had done what I could. The rest wasn't on me. Darla called. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, I took care of it. There was a pause. Good. Now let it go. I will. And this time I meant it. Whatever happened next wasn't my responsibility. Not anymore. In the days after I confronted Brian, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't like flipping a switch, more like a slow, steady release. For months, I'd been carrying this heavy weight on my shoulders. A sense of responsibility for Emily, for the wreckage of our marriage, for the mess she created with Brian. But after looking Brian in the eye and seeing how pathetic he really was, it finally clicked. None of that was mine to carry. I had done everything I could. I warned Emily. I made it clear to Brian that he wouldn't scare anyone. Beyond that, it wasn't on me anymore. And man, that felt freeing. For the first time in what felt like forever, life started moving forward. Work picked up, and I was closing deals faster than I had in months. Maybe it was because I was actually more focused, or maybe I was just throwing myself into work to fill the space where thoughts of Emily used to creep in. Either way, my numbers were solid, and even my boss took notice. Dan, I don't know what's gotten into you, but keep this up, he said one afternoon after I closed a big RV sale. At this rate, I might actually have to give you that raise you're always whining about. I smirked. It's about time. He laughed and gave me a slap on the back before heading off to micromanage someone else. For once, it felt good to laugh without that bitter edge. Things with Darla continued to evolve. Whatever it was between us wasn't exactly serious, but it wasn't just casual either. We didn't label it, and that worked just fine for both of us. Some nights we stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. Other nights we barely spoke, and the silence was comfortable. That was something I wasn't used to. With Emily, we filled every quiet moment with noise, like silence was some kind of threat. But with Darla, silence felt safe. She challenged me, pushed me in ways I didn't expect. But she never pushed too hard. She didn't let me wallow, but she didn't try to change me either. Being around her felt easy, natural. One night, we were sitting on her porch, sipping beers as the sky faded into darkness. Do you think you'll ever date again? She asked out of nowhere. I turned to look at her. Aren't we kind of doing that already? She gave me a crooked smile. Are we? I chuckled. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe. Look, I'm not rushing into anything. I think I've earned the right to take things slow. She nodded thoughtfully. Fair. There was a pause. But just so you know, she added, I'm not waiting around forever. I laughed. Duly noted. Despite how steady things felt with Darla, Emily's situation still hovered in the background. Michael Evans called again a few days later. Thought you'd want to know, Brian's gone. I straightened up. Gone? What do you mean? Checked out of that dumpy motel. No one's seen him since. Any clue where he went? Rumor is he skipped town. Maybe Florida, maybe somewhere else. But he's out of the picture. I let out a slow breath. Good. Emily's been quiet too, Michael added. No drama lately. Let's hope it stays that way. Michael chuckled. Sounds like you're finally free, Dan. Might be time you start acting like it. I smiled. A real smile. Yeah, I think I will. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from Emily or Megan. Brian remained a ghost, drifting off to whatever dark corner of the world would take him. The divorce was finalized without any more hiccups. The chapter was closed for good. One Saturday afternoon, my mom invited me over for dinner. I hadn't seen her much since everything with Emily fell apart. I guess part of me had been avoiding her. I was still angry over how she tried to push me to forgive Emily, but deep down, I knew she meant well. When I got there, she greeted me with a warm hug. You look better, she said, looking me over. Yeah, well, things are finally settling down. We sat down to eat, and for a while it felt normal, comforting. Halfway through the meal, she put her fork down and looked at me. I need to apologize. I looked up, caught off guard. For what? For pushing you to forgive Emily. I wasn't thinking about how much she hurt you. I was only thinking about how hard it was to see you alone. I didn't say anything right away. I just stared at my plate, moving the food around. It's fine, Mom. No, it's not. You're nothing like your father. I should have trusted you to handle things your way. I met her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something there. A quiet understanding. Maybe even regret. I'm not him, I said quietly. I know. That was the first real moment we'd had in a long time. After dinner, I drove around for a bit, aimlessly. Eventually, I ended up parked outside the dealership. The lot was empty, the RVs lined up neatly under the security lights. I just sat there, staring at them. So much had changed. My marriage was over. Emily was gone. Brian was gone. And I was still standing. No, I wasn't healed. I wasn't even close. But I was still here. The guy I used to be, the one who believed in perfect love and unconditional loyalty, he was gone. In his place was someone stronger. Harder, maybe, but smarter too. I thought about the promises I made to myself as a kid. That I'd never be like my father. That I'd never let anyone walk all over me. For a while I thought I had failed. But looking back now, I realized I hadn't. I stood my ground. I didn't excuse cheating. I didn't cling to something that was beyond saving. I walked away, and that was enough. Later that night, Darla called. You awake? She asked. Yeah. Wanna come over? I smiled. Yeah, I do. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.